Welcome to the Cannabis Research Webinar for September. Thank you all for joining us. We'll be getting started shortly, but first, we would like to allow a brief moment for the attendees to join the webinar. I see lots of people coming on. Lots of friends showing up. We'll just keep waiting for a little bit. Hi, everybody that's just joining. We're just waiting right now for more people to join. We've got about 20 people in the room so far. Tw 22, 23. It's going up quickly. Lots of people joining. I think we'll give it about one more minute. I still see people joining. I'll start here in just a minute with an introduction to today's webinar. I'm just going to give it a few more minutes for people that are still joining the meeting. Okay, I think we could get started. So, hello everybody, my name is Jeff Smith. I'm the interim director of the Institute of Cannabis Research hosted at Colorado State University, Pueblo. Welcome to the Cannabis Research Webinar Series, which is presented by the Institute of Cannabis Research and the Lambert Center for the Study of Medicinal Cannabis and Hemp at Thomas Jefferson University. This webinar series is in collaboration with the Lambert Center and is one of the many ways that the ICR works to promote the dissemination of cannabis research. For example, please navigate to our website, which can be found by Googling the words Institute of Cannabis Research. From there, you could navigate to our Outreach tab and find the current e-newsletter. You could also navigate to the Research tab in our website to view summaries of each of the research projects that the ICR is currently funding. You can also find information about our future webinars, which we present each month. Also, please note the link to the Journal of Cannabis Research, which the ICR sponsors. The journal is published by prestigious Springer Nature and is always looking for both high-quality scientific article submissions and reviewers. Before we get started with the presentation, I would like to mention some logistical items for today's webinar. Today's presentation will be followed by a short question and answer period. To ask a question, please do so using the Q&A feature in the Zoom toolbar. You can enter questions at any time during the presentation. We will address as many questions as time allows until the end of the hour. Please reserve the chat function in Zoom for technical issues and questions. Both the Q&A and chat functions can be found in the toolbar on your Zoom screen. It's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Ruth Charbonneau, who's the Associate Director of the Lambert Center, and she'll be introducing today's presenter and moderating the webinar.
Thank you, Jeff. We're pleased to have Dr. Cinnamon Bidwell with us today. Her primary research focus is translational studies investigating the effects of abused drugs and how these effects impact psychological and physical health acutely and chronically. For over a decade, she has been building on her training in studies of drug dependence, neurobehavior, behavioral genetics, and co-occurring psychiatric disorders. She has expertise in human laboratory studies on cannabis, cannabinoids, alcohol, and nicotine, and maintains research projects in the underlying factors that contribute to successful clinical treatment of psychiatric and substance use conditions. Her current research investigates the direct neurobiological effects of drugs of abuse, including high-potency marijuana and cannabinoids in psychiatric and medical populations, and the direct physiological and behavioral effects of cannabinoids as they pertain to both their abuse potential and potential therapeutic effects in observational as well as human laboratory studies. She has published over 70 scientific publications and 2 book chapters on the neurobiology of substance abuse and its overlap with psychiatric disorders. She will be presenting today on developing a model of cannabis psychopharmacology and harm reduction. And so welcome, and we look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to the ICR and the Lambert Center for hosting me and for the opportunity to share with you all today. I'm really excited to speak with you about the work we're doing in cannabis, psychopharmacology, particularly with behavioral health and harm reduction emphasis. So here we are. We have a lot to cover, so I'll dive right in. 2014. So this is actually the year I started my faculty position at CU Boulder, and I moved my lab from the East Coast to Boulder. And this is the same year that legal dispensaries opened in Colorado. So this led to increased availability of cannabis for recreational users, as well as heightening the conversation around medicinal use, right? We had families moving to Colorado to have access to the medicines they felt their loved ones needed in order to have a good quality of life. The current legal landscape looks like this, with nearly all states. At this point, only one lonely exception, which has not adopted some form of legalized cannabis. With all of these state level changes, use is increasing. Even Martha Stewart smokes weed. And the range of potencies, cannabinoids, and products available for legal use is rapidly expanding. But we still have continued federal prohibitions around cannabis, right? So science has had very limited ability to contribute in meaningful ways to these policy changes. It's this recently changed landscape that provides an important context for the work I'm going to share with you today. So to me, this puts in sharp relief the clear need for extending and increasing the evidence base in regards to the risks and benefits of cannabis. And as such, our research center has developed a fairly broad research program that addresses the effects of cannabis on health from a harm reduction perspective. As an introduction to this program, let me start by introducing you to our working model. So this is our working model of cannabis psychopharmacology and provides a foundation for the research studies I'm going to share with you today. We start here with initial THC exposure, producing the psychoactive effects. THC, specifically delta-9 THC, is the primary drug reward or intoxication agent for cannabis. And we know that THC interacts with the body's endogenous cannabinoid system through the CB1 and CB2 receptors. By agonizing these receptors in the central nervous system and throughout the periphery, we get the intoxicating, drug reward, and impairing effects of cannabis. We also get the short-term mood effects. So cannabis short-term produces both positive mood effects as well as negative mood effects. And the negative mood effects can range from mild anxiety all the way to more extreme mental states like paranoia. THC also has acute pain relieving, anti-inflammatory, and sleep-inducing properties, at least in the short term. Even with single use, you get downregulation of THC's primary pharmacological target, CB1. And all of the short-term effects I mentioned are subject to a process of tolerance. So with repeated use, these effects either reduce in intensity or require greater dosing to achieve that same effect. So as THC exposure increases, and then with repeated use of THC, CB1 downregulation will also increase and become more chronic. And with repeated use, the cycle of tolerance can become quite magnified. So after repeated exposure and often with heavier use comes a connection with abstinence and elevated experiences of negative affect and other types of withdrawal, which are then relieved by cannabis reuptake. So with negative reinforcement, the process of THC exposure continues. For a subset of users, oops, where are we? There we go. For a subset of users, this cycle of positive and negative reinforcement becomes more intense and rapid. And this results in about 10 to 12% of users developing some form of cannabis use disorder. So this model is seated within an emerging and growing literature, but cannabis research is in its relative infancy compared to the literature related to drugs like alcohol or tobacco. And the information we do have is based largely on either correlational data or the effects of very low potency THC cannabis that has historically been available for research. So both the harms and benefits of cannabis are widely undercharacterized. For example, cannabis withdrawal was not considered in our DSM or our clinical construct until the most recent version in 2013. So some of the basic components of this model, particularly as related to low potency THC, are fairly well seated even in this smaller literature. But what's not known is how this model looks in today's world. So we have very little understanding of how real-world products with high THC or greater diversity of cannabinoids impact the model, both in terms of negative outcomes and potentially positive therapeutic effects. So work in my lab is designed to further develop and substantiate this model, particularly with a much needed update for today's world. In the context of new and more potent cannabis products, we seek to understand how this model varies across dose of THC and with consideration of the hundreds of other cannabinoids present in cannabis. We also seek to understand how anxiety and anxiety relief operate within the model. And finally, we seek to incorporate medicinal use, so providing data that can maximize benefits and potential symptom relief in those who wish to leverage some of the known medicinal properties of cannabis, while also simultaneously minimizing potential harms and negative effects. So these three represent programmatic themes of my work that I'm going to share with you today. First, we'll talk about evaluation of risks of new and more potent cannabis forms. Second, we'll talk about the relationship of cannabis to behavioral health, including seeking answers around medically motivated cannabis use. And finally, due to the rapidly changing legal landscape, there are numerous ongoing policy discussions on cannabis in relation to health, equity, and public safety. So another branch of our work involves scientific engagement with policy relevant questions. You guys ready? Let's dive in. Cool. All right, so since legalization wave started about 10 years ago, there's been a shift in availability, a clear shift to new and more potent cannabis products. You can see here sales data from the first 5 years of legalization in Colorado, with highly potent THC concentrates clearly gaining market share, right? Increasing sales 508% in the first 5 years. A little bit about these high potency forms. What are cannabis concentrates? So these are highly potent forms of cannabis that are made by extracting or concentrating specific components of the plant. Typically, this is THC, but it can be other cannabinoids as well. And this process produces a highly potent wax or oil. Concentrates have lots of different names: bubble hash, hash oil, wax, shatter. They typically come in a range of potencies, from 65% at the low end to upwards of 90 to 95% THC at the high end. Correlational data suggests that these higher potency forms may come with additional risks, particularly increased cannabis-related harms like increased risk for cannabis use disorder and negative psychological impacts, and that these associations may be over and above just frequent cannabis use in general. These products are widely used, legally available in state markets, but because they're federally illegal, we have almost no preclinical or causal data on the impact of highly potent THC concentrates. So the need for research on these forms and the impacts of these high potency products has become a focus of work in our group. Given the basic structure of the working model, and our survey data suggesting higher and more chronic levels of negative affect and psychological disturbance in high potency users, a reasonable hypothesis is that given the extreme THC potencies of these products, concentrate use could represent a quicker, more intense pathway within the same model of cannabis psychopharmacology. However, before we started working in this space a few years ago, it was completely unknown whether use of high potency concentrates was actually associated with higher THC exposure, and or increased short-term psychoactive and impairing effects. So no one had examined what the acute effects of these products are in terms of THC exposure and these short-term effects. And because concentrates are only available on state markets, in order to study them, we had to work to develop a federally compliant research methodology that enabled experimental research on commercially available products. So what does this look like? A little bit more about our design. So as I'm sure many of you are familiar, academic researchers, in order to be compliant with federal law, are unable to bring these legal market forms into our laboratories. However, we've worked with our federal funders, such as NIDA, our administration, and IRB at CU Boulder, to instead bring the lab to the people. Enter the mobile pharmacology lab. This design tool allows us to conduct psychopharmacological cannabis research in a mobile environment. Participants self-administer legal market cannabis in their homes, and we are able to assess them in the mobile lab both before and after they use their cannabis. The lab is outfitted to do the full range of assessments that we would typically complete in our laboratory: phlebotomy, blood draws, cognitive and psychomotor assessments, as well as clinical and psychological measures. The mobile lab was originally funded by NIDA through a grant acquired by my close colleague, Ken Hutchison, and we quickly leveraged it for a state of Colorado funded project to assess the effects of these very high potency cannabis concentrates. The goal of these initial projects was to assess whether THC potencies at the levels available on the legal market impacted or worsened acute intoxication, acute impairing effects, and abuse liability of cannabis. So how did this work? So we recruited 120 regular cannabis users who all had previous exposure to these high potency forms. They had to have used concentrates at some point in their life. They were relatively young, average age about 28, and they were relatively frequent users, having used cannabis at least 21 of the last 30 days. They came into our lab and completed a comprehensive health assessment at that appointment. And then they were randomly assigned to a cannabis concentrate that they themselves purchased at our partner dispensary. So after our in-lab appointment, once they were enrolled in the study, they would be randomly assigned to a certain form of concentrate that they would then go and purchase. In this case, in this first study, the product was either a 70 or 90% THC concentrated hash oil. To put this in perspective, the majority of prior cannabis administration studies had typically evaluated the effects of cannabis ranging from 3 to maximum of maybe around 10 or 12% THC. We then held a follow-up appointment in the mobile lab, and the goal of this appointment was to assess the effects of these two different forms of cannabis, both before and after at-home administration. Primary outcomes included measures relevant to cannabis-related harm, THC exposure via blood cannabinoids, as well as subjective intoxication and mood effects, and objective measures of psychomotor and cognitive impairment that are relevant to cannabis use. So the results of this first study were published a few years ago and provided the first window into the effects of these high potency forms. So what I show you here is THC exposure before and after use of high potency cannabis concentrates. You see the expected quadratic effect of time. THC levels peak immediately after use and go down an hour later. And this is as expected. Our average THC levels after concentrate use are around 300 nanograms per mil in plasma. When it comes to comparing the two concentrate potency groups, in our design, when people naturalistically self-administer, there are not differences between these two potency groups. So whether or not they used a 70 or 90% THC, they hit the same levels of THC in plasma on average. This suggests that they're titrating up to a particular level of high, regardless of potency, or potentially that there's an upper limit of THC levels that we're hitting with these very high THC products. Compare these blood levels after concentrate use to those from a parallel study of flower users. These flower users use products averaging around 20% THC. Peak blood levels for flower users came in around 120 nanograms per mil. And you can see that THC blood levels after concentrate use is about 3 times higher. However, when we look at subjective effects, like subjective high and other intoxication measures, those do not show dose effects that tracked across the potency groups. Individuals use products that range from 16 to 20% flower all the way to 90% concentrate. And across these THC levels, the levels of intoxication were similar across groups. Importantly, this pattern held for positive and negative short-term mood effects, as well as various objective measures of cognitive and psychomotor impairment. And those are all in the paper, although I don't have time to walk you through each of those findings here. We interpreted these findings as due to self-titration up to a desired level of high. So when participants use naturalistically and are free to self-dose, they're able to modulate their use to a particular intoxication level. But what was pretty surprising is that they could do this even when using a 90% THC concentrate, right? And in addition, when you see the discrepant blood levels, right, how different they are from flower to concentrate use, coupled with similar levels of intoxication and objective impairment, it's pretty clear that a hefty tolerance to cannabis drug effects is developed in those who are regular users of high potency THC. So with this first mobile lab study, we'd ask the question, is naturalistic use of high potency forms associated with greater intoxication and greater impairment than lower potency forms? And the answer was, well, yes and no. We saw much higher THC blood exposure in the concentrate users, but we did not see increased intoxication and impairment. And from there, inferred increased tolerance in the concentrate group. So with that first mobile lab study, we confirmed certain aspects of our model and took a large step in improving its external validity. But of course, also this work raised more questions. So whether or not high potency concentrates were producing vastly different acute effects from flower, clearly follow-up is needed on some of these potentially harmful effects with this very high level of THC blood exposure, as well as increased tolerance over time. So we wanted to test our ideas about how to reduce the potential harms associated with that level of chronic THC exposure. So we launched a second study focused on the harm-reducing potential of CBD. Cannabidiol, CBD, the second most prevalent cannabinoid, pharmacologically very different from THC, whereas THC agonizes the CB1 and CB2 receptors, producing the intoxicating and dose-dependent drug reward properties. CBD has a much more diffuse pharmacology that's still being characterized today. But we do know at these same receptor sites, its pharmacological action is as a low affinity inverse CB1 agonist, so thus opposing some of the actions of THC. With this, CBD produces a variety of effects, including anxiolytic or anxiety-reducing effects, as well as anti-inflammatory effects, but without intoxication or abuse liability. So with these known pharmacological properties, CBD may regulate the reinforcing and motivational effects of THC. So we hypothesized that CBD could reduce THC exposure, alter THC's acute effects, and thereby altering the course of that upper pathway of the model and potentially altering overall risk for abuse liability in these high potency users. In addition, with the higher levels of negative affect and concentrate users, we were very interested in CBD's potential anxiolytic properties in this study as well. So study 2, the design was very similar to study 1. It included both a baseline and a mobile lab appointment. We recruited 54 regular concentrate users. They were again relatively young and used cannabis relatively frequently, 21 again of the last 30 days. In this study, the products were either a THC dominant or a CBD dominant concentrated hash oil. I'm going to spend a minute talking about the products because it's important to understanding the results. So in line with the naturalistic design of the study, the products were selected to reflect commonly used forms of concentrates on our legal market. So for example, the THC product is an 85% THC with less than 1% CBD. And this is based on the typical profile of THC concentrates at the average profile used and sold on our Colorado legal market. CBD dominant product, on the other hand, was selected based on the highest level of CBD we could find available on the legal market. And this is based on the notion that CBD has this low pharmacological affinity for the CB1 and hints in the prior literature indicating that to see effects of CBD on THC-related outcomes, studies need to be evaluating super high doses of CBD. A final note on the product is that it's common for high CBD concentrates to contain some level of THC. In this case, the CBD dominant form contained just under 5% THC. Similar to study one, the mobile lab appointment was held to assess the effects of naturalistic and acute use of study products and measures related to cannabis harm. Another design aspect of the study is that between the baseline and the mobile lab naturalistic administration appointment, we included a 5-day period of what's called ad libitum use. Participants had 5 days after they purchased their product to use as much or as little of it as they wished. So recall, these are heavy cannabis users, and we did not expect that typically use concentrates. So we did not expect those assigned to a CBD form would entirely stop using their regular high potency forms. However, we simply asked that they purchase and use their study product as much or as little as they wanted and observe their use patterns and cannabinoid exposure during that time. This is the first aspect of the study. The data from that aspect of the study that I'm going to show you is how access to a high CBD product impacted the quantity and frequency of THC use in these high potency users over that 5-day observational period. Our self-report data on frequency and quantity suggested that concentrate users in both product groups used at a similar frequency over the 5-day period. However, when it came to THC exposure as measured through THC biomarkers, there were significant differences across the two product groups. THC-CU, I'm showing you data here from THC-CU, that's a secondary metabolite of THC and considered an important marker across the literature of chronic use and longer-term THC exposure. So here you see data from THC-CU at baseline and at the end of that 5-day observational period. CU was significantly lower after 5 days in those assigned to the CBD dominant concentrate as compared to those assigned to a THC form. So the concentrate users who had purchased and had access to a high CBD form had reduced THC exposure just over those 5 days. Similarly, although not shown here, we have results from another biomarker of endogenous cannabinoid function, specifically anandamide, which is an endogenous ligand of CB1 receptors. So anandamide tends to be depleted in regular cannabis users, and our results suggest higher levels of AEA after 5 days of exposure or availability of a high CBD product. So this suggests improvement or rebound of anandamide with 5 days of access to this high CBD form. And we take that as another sign of a healthier endocannabinoid system and potentially another marker of harm reduction in these high potency users. Next, we wanted to understand the acute effects of these two types of concentrates. This work was recently published by my former postdoc, Hollis Caroly, who's now a faculty member at CSU. And I think she was a webinar presenter a couple of months ago, and our co-mentor graduate student, Megan Drennan. So not surprisingly, we found that THC dominant concentrates induced higher levels of subjective high or intoxication than the CBD dominant form. Immediately after use, that's shown here, you see immediately after use an expected spike in drug intoxication, and that this is maintained an hour later. This pattern is also present for subjective ratings of drug liking, with the THC group showing higher ratings of drug liking after use of their product. Here, subjective drug intoxication and drug liking are super relevant as they're measures connected with drug reward and ultimately abuse liability. So I told you earlier that CBD is not intoxicating. So you might be wondering why there's some level of intoxication here after use of the CBD dominant form. Recall that the CBD concentrate contains about 5% THC. So it's still producing some of the rewarding and intoxicating drug effects that our study population of heavy recreational users may actually be seeking, just at a slightly lower level. When it comes to subjective mood and psychological effects, similarly, both products produce positive mood typical of THC. In the left-hand figure, you can see results from concentrate effects on positive mood, and these show increases in positive mood immediately after use in both product forms. However, when it comes to the impact on negative mood states, there were product differences. Specifically, we looked at effects of these products on paranoia, a negative mental state associated with THC use. Here, as shown on the right, paranoia is elevated in the THC group, but is not increased after use in the CBD product group. In addition, although not shown here, the CBD formulation had a stronger and more immediate effect on reducing negative affect and tension than did the THC formulation. So in this study, ad libitum CBD reduced THC exposure as indicated by those lower THC COOP biomarkers. We also saw higher anandamide levels, thus endocannabinoid system rebound, for those concentrate users who had access to a high CBD product via the study. Intoxication, drug reward, including positive mood and memory impairment as well, were present after use of both concentrate formulations, but these drug effects were generally stronger in the THC dominant form and less intense in the CBD dominant form. In addition, those in the CBD dominant condition saw a strong short-term reduction in anxiety with no measurable paranoia. So while this is a relatively early and small naturalistic study, overall, by altering this top section of the pathway, the pattern may be interpreted as a harm reduction effect of a CBD dominant cannabis. So we saw some level of drug effects and drug reward, but overall decreased THC exposure, improved endogenous cannabinoid health, reduced anxiety, and decreased negative effects. So short-term and naturalistic, but it's still important to remember that these results are in individuals who typically use very high THC products and use those products quite regularly. So any reduction in THC exposure or abuse liability is potentially relevant to their long-term clinical risk. So we take these data as value in continuing to probe CBD to reduce harm in heavy high potency cannabis users and users with cannabis use disorder. We have plans to follow up these findings and extend our data more fully across the entire model, with several studies scored or under review or even just launching. So including a couple that I'll highlight here. We have a project arm within a proposed NIDA P50 application in collaboration with investigators at CU Anschutz, with my colleague Kent Hutchison as center lead. In this project, we're going to move beyond a naturalistic study and conduct a randomized placebo-controlled trial to evaluate long-term use of super high-dose CBD in reducing abuse liability and THC use in concentrate users. I also have a grant under review where I'm hoping to further characterize that lower pathway with an R01 aim to examine abstinence and reuptake in concentrate users. So if we can specifically characterize those fine-grained affective and withdrawal processes involved in brief and long-term periods of abstinence, will help us understand abuse liability and risk in this population. Okay, moving away from our work in high potency and turning attention now to questions around cannabis use and behavioral health, particularly seeking more concrete and externally valid data in relation to medically motivated cannabis use. Anxiety, sleep, and pain are the three most commonly cited medical motives for cannabis use. We have work in all three of these health areas. Today, I'm going to focus primarily on our work in anxiety and affective health. While anxiety is a top-cited reason for medicinal use of cannabis, I'm sure it's not lost on you that anxiety and negative affect also permeate this model and link with abuse liability as well. Anxiety and general negative affect are both an antecedent and consequence of individual sessions of cannabis use. Thus, they're deeply associated with this cycle of repeated use. We've touched on the notion that high-dose THC may intensify these affective associations. However, other data suggest that low levels of cannabis use, maybe low levels of THC, may be protective against anxiety. And we certainly have more recent preclinical and some human data to support the fairly profound anxiolytic or anxiety-reducing properties of cannabidiol. Lastly, anxiety is linked with higher levels of peripheral and neural inflammation in rodent and human models. And both THC and CBD are thought to modulate pro-inflammatory cytokines, suggesting that one mechanistic pathway by which cannabinoids may reduce anxiety is through their impacts on immune system function. This literature is limited in similar ways as the broader cannabis science space. We have limited human and mostly correlational data with limited evaluation of direct effects and varied doses of specific cannabinoids. However limited, our prior data does suggest some hypotheses. First, long-term chronic THC use is likely associated with higher anxiety, but the short-term acute effects can go both ways, depending on the study, the individual, the dose. but with higher doses tending to be anxiogenic or anxiety-inducing. Preclinical data tell us that CBD would likely reduce anxiety in the short term, but it's relatively unknown whether CBD would have longer-term effects on anxiety. In addition, both THC and CBD are thought to inhibit the production of pro-inflammatory agents, albeit via different pathways. So the anti-inflammatory effects of cannabinoids may be one mechanism underlying some of their anxiety-related effects. So while researchers are out there working to ride the regulatory gauntlet and build a pyramid of evidence around cannabis and anxiety, we have millions of patients out there in the real world using legal market forms to self-treat. So we launched a federally compliant mobile lab study to push this work forward and probe real-world use of THC and CBD in relation to anxiety and peripheral inflammation. We recruited a community sample of over 300 individuals who self-reported at least mild to moderate generalized anxiety symptoms. And this included both non-users and user groups. Our cannabis user groups were randomly assigned to one of 3 cannabinoid conditions for 4 weeks of self-directed use. These conditions fell into one of the 3 following categories. So they were either assigned to a THC dominant, a 1-to-1 THC plus CBD, or a CBD dominant form. We also held appointments in the mobile lab to assess short-term effects of these products. So from our working model, it's important to assess both longer-term and acute effects in the same study, as these effects can go in opposite directions. Over the past 4 years, we've recruited one of the largest experimental samples out there that I'm aware of on this question, and we've just wrapped up data collection in time for me to share some preliminary results with y'all. Before I get into results, a bit more about our design. So individuals with self-reported anxiety came into the lab for a comprehensive baseline assessment. This included a blood draw for current levels of cannabinoids and immune markers, including circulating cytokines. At that appointment, they were assigned to one of 3 cannabis strains that they themselves purchased at our partner dispensary. That they were asked to use only their study cannabis then they were asked to use only their study cannabis for the next 4 weeks. Okay, but participants were free to administer that cannabis as they wished. They could use as much or as little of it as they wanted. 2 weeks later, they returned to our lab for a follow-up appointment. This was to get a mid-study assessment of the primary affective and immune measures, as well as verify product compliance with a blood draw for cannabinoid exposure. Then finally, a 4-week appointment took place in the mobile lab at participants' homes. At this appointment, participants came out to the van prior to having used any cannabis that day. They did a comprehensive assessment, including a blood draw, returned to their home to self-administer their study product, and immediately came back out to the mobile lab for a repeated biobehavioral assessment while under the influence of their cannabis product. Our non-users also had 2 assessments over a similar time frame without consuming cannabis in between. Primary measures for this study were related to short and long-term affective processes, as well as immune and cannabinoid biomarkers. With data collection recently wrapping up, we're actively analyzing these data, and I'm excited to share our preliminary findings on our primary outcomes. We have 2 fantastic postdocs in the lab, Carrie Skrinsky and Jonathan Lasano, that are working on these models. And our goal with this large biobehavioral data set was to use statistical approaches that account for factors largely ignored in prior research. So looking with these data at greater nuance, for example, trying to understand different cannabinoids, including varying levels of frequency and dose of study product, peak and chronic levels of THC and CBD, as well as examine the direct effects of cannabinoid exposure on peripheral inflammatory cytokines. This first graph represents our data on anxiety symptoms tracked over 4 weeks of self-directed use. All groups start at or close to the moderate anxiety range, and everyone gets better down to or close to the normal range of anxiety after 4 weeks. This is consistent with the ebb and flow of anxiety over time. However, when you consider the level of THC exposure as a predictor of anxiety change over the 4-week period, we see a more nuanced picture emerging. So when we use peak THC as a predictor of change in anxiety, there's a consistent moderating effect of THC exposure level on the extent of anxiety reduction. Those with the highest level of THC exposure improve the least, and those with the lowest levels of THC exposure improve the most. Similarly, When we examine change over time on our pro-inflammatory cytokines, the low THC dose is associated with the greatest change in pro-inflammatory markers, such that lower THC exposure levels are associated with the greatest reduction in our summary score of pro-inflammatory cytokines over the 4-week period. The average and high THC groups show basically no change in cytokines. So the THC exposure group with the greatest reductions in anxiety also had the greatest reductions in cytokines. So we're working to further refine these analyses. And if these associations hold, to my knowledge, this will be the first study to make a link among THC dose, changes in immune markers, and change in anxiety outside of animal models. Transitioning now from longer-term effects of cannabinoids on anxiety processes to acute effects of THC and CBD on short-term mood states. This graph represents our acute ratings of anxiety and tension in the mobile lab. And as you can see, after use of a CBD-dominant cannabis, individuals show significant reduction in tension and anxiety, whereas we see a slight increase in tension and anxiety in the THC group, and basically no measurable change in the 1-to-1 and non-user groups. This pattern of THC either worsening or showing no change in negative mood states and CBD associated with relief from negative mood states is consistently demonstrated across these data. For example, even with more extreme negative mental states like paranoia, only the THC group shows measurable increases after use. In this next figure, we shift the impact of the 3 product groups on more positively valenced drug states. So here, use of all 3 forms of cannabis are associated with some level of subjective high or intoxication in the short term. However, these effects are strongest in the THC dominant forms. And we see the same pattern across other acute measures involving positive mood states and drug reward, with the majority of these effects being strongest in the 2 THC containing product groups, but not entirely absent in the CBD product forms. With this brief look at these data, we have a window in the differential impacts of THC and CBD on short and long-term anxiety and circulating cytokines. Long-term, we saw no pure group effect of product type, but THC exposure had differential effects on anxiety and peripheral inflammation. In no case did THC increase anxiety, but the lowest levels of THC reflected the greatest levels of improvement and the greatest anti-inflammatory effects. We did not see associations with CBD use or exposure and long-term changes in anxiety in either direction. But short-term, we saw that when people are allowed to self-titrate and self-dose, there were not big effects of THC on acute or short-term anxious mood states. This is counter to some findings from controlled dosing studies. When individuals are dosed at a specific level of THC, regardless of experience or preference, in those studies, higher doses tend to induce higher levels of anxiety or paranoia. We also saw short-term effects of CBD on tension reduction and fewer negative drug effects with CBD versus THC use. So this is preliminary, but suggests to us a few things. One, consistent with our prior work, and because of individual differences in metabolism and tolerance, studies that involve self-titration and self-dosing reveal different patterns than controlled dosing studies. 2, THC dose matters in terms of the impact on anxiety and inflammation. Finally, these human data substantiate the emerging preclinical data on the profound short-term anxiolytic effects of CBD. While in this study, those short-term effects don't translate to long-term differences, long-term trajectory differences in terms of anxiety symptoms, short-term relief without abuse liability or negative drug effects should be taken seriously. I want to share briefly another type of data we have to leverage in this sample. So throughout the 4-week study, participants complete daily surveys on their cannabis use, affect, sleep, and other health behaviors, with sleep disturbance and anxiety being highly comorbid, both falling at or near the top of the list of medical uses of cannabis. Of course, we wanted to test the relationship among cannabis use and sleep in this same anxiety sample. This work is co-led by my graduate student, Renee Martin-Willett, who has an interest in understanding co-use of cannabis and alcohol in relation to behavioral health. So when we look at daily variations in cannabis and alcohol use and daily variations in sleep quality, we see a direct and positive impact of cannabis use days on better sleep. When we look at daily use or non-use of alcohol, we see no connection with sleep quality. So the effect is the main effect of daily cannabis use on improving perceived quality of sleep. This gets a bit more interesting when we consider additional moderators of these short-term sleep effects. First, the effect of cannabis on higher quality sleep is significantly stronger in individuals using edible forms. Results show a main between person effect of cannabis form when you compare flower versus edible, and with edible users reporting higher levels and higher quality of sleep. In addition, we see an interaction with cannabinoids in cannabis form, such that it's the high CBD edibles that have the most beneficial effects of sleep. So for those of you in the audience taking notes about how to improve your sleep, please note these effects are in a specific population of individuals who already report mild to moderate generalized anxiety symptoms, and many of whom were at least occasionally using THC products at the start of the study. We also wanted to understand how baseline psychopathology and individual differences in the severity of baseline symptoms moderate the effects of cannabis. So in these data, results suggest that the sleep aid effects of cannabis are strongest in individuals who came into the study with the highest affective symptoms. So this figure on the right shows baseline DAS score. This is a combined depression, anxiety, and stress negative affect score. And it shows that baseline levels of negative affect moderate the relationship among daily cannabis use and sleep, such that the sleep aid effects on cannabis days are strongest in individuals at the highest levels of negative affect. These early analyses suggest that our primary hypotheses are confirmed. THC and CBD may impact anxiety and health-related behaviors differently. Most prominently, ad libitum CBD use is associated with acute anxiety reductions, better sleep, and few, if any, cannabis-related harms. We're seeing hints of interesting effects of THC dose in cannabis form, as well as important consideration to the severity of affective symptoms present at the start of the study. In terms of next steps, primarily we have much more analyses to do with this very rich biobehavioral data set and have the goal of refining our signals in order to really fully comprehend all the associations we're seeing in these data. Finally, moving to the third arm of our work that I'm going to share with you today, which involves empirical engagement with public policy. Because of the rapidly changing legal landscape and cannabis policy landscape, a crucial part of our mission is to engage with and allow science to contribute to policy discussions. I want to take a few moments to highlight the aspects of our research that are directly policy facing. You're like, wait a second, full legal adult access in Colorado in 2014, right? We figured it out. Well, there are loads of cannabis-related policy questions still being addressed in our state, and of course, federally as well. In the state of Colorado, we had 66 total bills that refer in some way to cannabis that have been introduced and passed in the past 2 legislative cycles. I've been involved in consultation on some of these, including many in the topic areas of expanding the capacity and infrastructure to support strong cannabis research and research training across the state. There are also many initiatives around reducing public health risks, particularly around high potency cannabis, and access and use by vulnerable populations, such as adolescents and pregnant nursing mothers. And a third major topic area is equitable access, particularly to medical cannabis, as well as equitable enforcement of cannabis laws, including work to develop science and equity-based policies around workplace and driving safety. This last one is a complicated goal. Policymakers recognize that we have a major public safety and equity problem when it comes to roadside testing for cannabis-impaired driving. Despite data that cannabis impairment may impact the ability to safely drive a motor vehicle, there are no validated and objective cannabis impairment tests. Blood THC thresholds, which are frequently the legal standard, while objective, are not valid indicators of either recent use or impairment. They have the undesirable effect of over-identifying regular users who may always have some level of circulating THC and may under-identify occasional users who lack tolerance and may show impairment even at very low levels. Beyond blood levels, many of the roadside tests in use are subjective and subject to both conscious and unconscious racial and ethnic biases that exist in law enforcement. Thus, it's a major equity and public safety need for brief and mobile objective assessments that can reliably detect either recent use or impairment, ideally both. So our designs can contribute to these efforts, as we've used the mobile lab methodology to evaluate impairment after use of a wide range of real-world products in a wide range of users. These are results from a study led again by my former postdoc, Hollis Carrolley, where individuals are given a few different balance tasks to complete. For example, being asked to stand as still as possible under different visual conditions, and all of their movements, large or small, are picked up with the accelerometer contained in a smartphone attached to their hip. Here are the results. We have a quadratic effect of acute use with significantly impaired balance immediately after use that's recovered to a participant's baseline an hour later. This impairment does not seem to differ by the potency of cannabis used, and we've now replicated this finding in concentrate users, flower users, and edible users too. Here, balance seems to be our one psychomotor function that we measured that gets worse immediately after use and then recovers within an hour, and holds true across a range of products and even in relatively heavy users. So fine-grained balance may be a good candidate for detection of acute use or immediate cannabis impairment, even in very tolerant users. So we treat this as fertile ground for continued work in the search for objective and mobile methods to detect cannabis use or impairment roadside. We work to continue this work primarily by supporting other scientists with relevant expertise. I work on a grant with Ashley Brooks Russell that leverages a naturalistic administration procedure to collect data both before and after cannabis use on a range of brief psychomotor assessments, as well as with a goal of making more direct links with driving behavior via assessments on a full driving simulator. In addition, we've leveraged our mobile methods to collaborate with the National Institute on Standards and Technology, as well as the National Institute of Justice, to work on methods for collection and detection of cannabinoids in breath for a potential cannabis breathalyzer. Finally, another policy relevant question that we work on is the validity and content of cannabis product labels on our state regulated market. Currently, products require testing and reporting of 5 specific cannabinoids, as well as meeting standards for various contaminants. The goal of this testing and label program is for users to understand and mitigate how much risk is in their product, and also to support medical users interested in consistent, reliable dosing. However, there are some valid questions about the independence of these testing facilities, as well as the accuracy of the information that ultimately ends up on these labels. Again, our designs focused on naturalistic use and real-world products allow a unique angle to address some of these questions. In a recent study, we evaluated a wide range of edible products, and we reported a strong correlation, 0.83, that emerged between THC consumed based on the product label information and peak levels of THC exposure as measured by biologically verified THC plasma levels collected through a blood draw. Similarly high correlations were found between the CBD product label content as well as peak CBD in blood. So here we're seeing pretty tight connections between what people are reporting on the product label versus the cannabinoid exposure people are actually getting, suggesting that, despite these valid concerns, at least these edible products were consistently, if not accurately, labeled. However, it's clear we need systematic testing and more data across a wider range of products and product types to fully understand the success or failures of our statewide testing and labeling programs. So with a project grant from the Institute of Cannabis Research, thank you very much, and leveraging these research questions, my student Ashley Master and I are pursuing a comprehensive research study in partnership with a MedPharm collaborator that will be the first to conduct independent product testing and label verification on a wide range of Colorado cannabis products. For so many reasons, both medical and recreational users deserve accurately labeled products. This also aids in our research endeavors if we have more confidence in the labeling and contents of various products. So this policy-facing work on labels and roadside testing ultimately informs the larger model in improving our ability to quantify cannabinoid exposure across products and research studies, and addresses cannabis impairment in a more fine-grained and public health relevant fashion. Broadly, the work I've shared with you aims to further establish and increase the biobehavioral evidence base for this model, and we've worked to increase its external validity by evaluating it with a wider range of products, and including the impact of cannabinoids beyond low-dose THC. We're also interested in the role of anxiety in this model as an antecedent and short-term effect, as well as long-term consequence of cannabis use. We've also worked to make broader links among specific cannabinoids and biobehavioral health. Goal of this work is to address clinically relevant questions and build up an externally valid policy relevant model and provide the most relevant information to a variety of stakeholders interested in evaluating the harms and benefits of cannabis. We and others have a lot more work to do in this space. And the ultimate goal here is shared between my lab and the scientific community. We want to provide meaningful data that can guide policy and individual decisions to promote less harmful and safer use of cannabis. Thank you so much for your attention. I need to take a moment to acknowledge deep appreciation for the incredible staff, students, and team at CU Change. I also want to thank my close colleagues, Dr. Angela Bryan and Dr. Ken Hutchinson, who contributed very closely to all of this work I've shared with you today, as well as the host of collaborators and colleagues locally, nationally, and internationally who contribute to this work and bring their own scientific disciplinary expertise to bear on these questions that allow it to make a broader and more expansive positive impact. So thank you very much.
So we have quite a few questions, but starting with from your data, it appears that plasma THC concentration does not reflect subjective high. Is there a better plasma marker of subjective high, such as one of the THC metabolites?
I do not believe so. I believe that, so you have THC, and THC OH is the first pass metabolite, right? And that's a psychoactive metabolite. You can look at, there's different models. Do you look just at THC or do you combine THC with THC-OH? And it's essentially the same thing. You're not going to see really strong correlations between subjective intoxication or even objective measures of impairment with blood THC. Issues of tolerance and metabolism really complicate that, which means if you're trying to find an objective measure of cannabis impairment, I'm not confident that plasma THC will be the answer. Plasma cannabinoids will be the answer.
While the studies were randomized to product, I understand that the participants purchased those products themselves, hence studies were not blinded. Can you comment on how this may affect your interpretation of results?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So these are not placebo-controlled studies. I think placebo-controlled studies generally, and even in controlled administrations trials, are tricky with cannabis. They may be technically placebo-controlled, but participants are rarely blind, right? They often know whether or not they were given cannabis or placebo. So it is a challenge. It's a challenge in a lot of research with psychoactive drugs to find an adequate placebo. I would say that cuts across the alcohol, psilocybin literatures as well. So it's certainly expectancies are part of the story. We do collect a lot of data on expectancies. We haven't had a chance to dive in, but we have specifically data on, what are your expectancies around CBD? What are your expectancies around THC? And as we get larger samples and, more time, we will certainly dig into those data. I think it's a really interesting piece of the puzzle here. Thanks for the question.
We are approaching the hour, so I'm going to thank you and let all the questioners know that we'll forward the questions that were not gotten to today, but we really appreciate Dr. Bidwell's presentation, and just let her know there's a lot of appreciation in the comments in terms of the presentation as well as questions. So with that, thank you, and we appreciate your time with ICR and the Lambert Center.
Of course. Thanks for your attention and great questions. Appreciate it. My pleasure.